don't think I've exactly made it secret that I've been pretty critical of a lot of the storytelling that Hoyoverse has been doing recently. I have some catching up to do in Honkai Star Rail version. It's kind of a drag for me to get through the main story, although admittedly there are some very good moments. But for now, I want to focus on the newest story quest for Genshin, which I've been much more critical of, Interlude Act 4 Paralogism. There's a couple of reasons I come to this more hopeful that we're going to get something good. For one, the fact that it's an interlude quest means that we are likely transitioning out of Natlan's storytelling tropes, so hopefully we'll be leaving some of the worst writing practices in Natlan behind here. And for two, interlude quests honestly have a pretty high standard, with almost all of them having a lot of emotional weight, thanks to how strongly they tend to tie to the story of the entire world, and not just one particular reason. I decided to take this video in a different direction than I did with the Natlan Chapter 5 video, so I've actually written this intro before playing the quest, and the rest of the script will be kind of during and after. Warning for spoilers ahead, let's teleport our asses to Mondstadt. So we come in during the Windbloom Festival, and this time things are a little weird. We do get the inside scoop on part of the way that this is so strange, and that's because Albedo, the Geo-Alchemist guy, is on trial for murder. I mean, I gotta say, that's one hell of an elevator pitch for the start of this thing. Now, as we're going through the first trial, those of you that know the pre-existing storyline well will probably realize what the evidence is pointing to the answer being pretty quickly, especially if you were playing during Shadows Amid Snowstorms in December of 2021, which draws a lot of inspiration from John Carpenter's The Thing. As we all know, a movie which clearly wasn't inspiring any other media of the time period at all. I think it would have been better if Sus Beto was in permanent story content, but I know that Genshin has changed things before based on if you had access to previous event story content or not, so I feel a little bit more confident that there's some kind of accommodation there. That being said, if you didn't already know that Albedo was innocent, well, okay, sort of, we'll cover that in the next part, the quest seems to do a good job of presenting doubt. The investigation part actually solidifies this concept pretty well. We eventually get roped into doing an independent investigation, which pretty much gets narrowed down to looking at Albedo's desk, finding a map, and getting our classic horror movie trope of the villain not actually being dead. Or, like, revived? Maybe? Something like that. Point is that it got out of the grave. So another thing that the imposter can apparently do now is impersonate multiple people at once, although based on the way that the trial ends, it does seem that the result is that the imposter has more limited ability to manipulate their form on the fly while doing this. Oh, and we also find out that this whole thing was staged, planned to defend against an attack from the monsters of Dragonspine, including Sus Beto, because of the Dragon Durin's heart still beating. As we reach the actual point where we're defending the city, it seems clear that we're going to get more into Durin's role in all this, rather than just being, you know, a dead alchemical corpse further in the story. I might be a bit partial to this, since this is a direct continuation of one of my favorite event stories, but I really liked what was here. The twists, even the ones that aren't based on what we already know, do actually have moments to telegraph them pretty well. The fact that this was all a setup, for example, gets hinted at when it seems like pretty much every neutral party wants us to look further into what's going on and present evidence. A few people that turn out to be imposters, especially Miles, actually get behavioral cues that point towards this being the case. And even if you don't already know about Shadows Amid Snowstorms, you know, I'm pretty sure you'd already be able to pick up on the fact that something could have crawled out of the shallow grave in Dragonspine. There's definitely some choices I didn't like. For some reason, Jean was presenting that we found the map, but it took prodding for us to present what we found at the Dragonspine site that was on it, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me given how other people were presenting testimony of evidence they discovered, and the fact that this spot didn't match the others creates a lot of reasonable doubt that gets expanded upon. So it would seem like it should be said up front, but I felt the overall pace was good and things did keep moving. Well, actually, there is like one pacing issue that I really want to talk about, although granted it's kind of between parts of the story. Normally, the way these are paced is that you wind up with these breakpoints, normally indicated by when the name of the individual quest at the side of the screen changes. This is normally, you know, a moment where it's cool to take a break and go do something else in the game, or go do something else in life, which for multi-hour quest lines can be really important. Now, this quest does have these, what I call name breaks, but the first one occurs basically right after the trial, and I'm still in story mode, being warned that leaving story mode may rewind progress. When I got back into the game later, I found that I was out of story mode when I logged out in story mode, and was actually pretty decently far away from where the story was. I say pretty decently far away, like a different part of Mondstadt. The whole thing of these two seems to be that they're meant to be part of the same quest and done in a little over an hour, but I don't think changing the quest name in the middle of it does that very well. This doesn't happen at the end of The Hunger of Many, by the way, so this at the very least doesn't seem to be a recurring thing. Right, so enough about that shit. Next section. We're kind of going around Mondstadt fighting monsters as various characters, which is probably a better and more focused battle sequence than, the big Natlin one. The use of trial characters works well to give fights a more dynamic feel, even if you could complain that not getting to use your own teams in this section takes away from the mindfulness in building your favorites. Still, if we're in the story and we're putting the focus on the protagonist of that part of the story, I do actually like that. We've also got smaller things like the optional little side quest of finding a place for Bennett to go for shelter, which turns out to be the bar Diona runs. So the side characters to this story arc are getting screen time as well. We are using the need to defend different areas as a way to expand on the story, since we have a few conversations as part of the running around. So let's kind of start at the beginning of that. For one, turns out Albedo did murder some people, but he saw them vent, so it's fine. Also, apparently the imposters are Durin now? Something to that effect. They're like from Durin's stomach or something. Basically, all of the schemery was intended to get the imposter to use more of their power so they could figure out who else was under the influence of dragon fuckery. There's more subterfuge needed though, because there's a mole within the Knights of Favonius. So Venti basically creates magic walkie-talkies with the wind that only people with his blessing can communicate with, which doesn't include the one under Durin's influence. They seem to have already known who this is, and this is the main thing to the overarching concept in this part of the story, and it's also a little sloppy. So, first of all, Venti's air jets carrying voices, but only if he says so, is some absolute hand-wavy bullshit. You expect some of this, we're basically in an anime after all, but I'm not gonna pretend that it's not pulled out of thin air, pun very much intended. Especially since, by the way, we just had a long-distance magical communication with selected partners in Natlin. Next up, let's talk about them knowing who the third imposter in the Knights of Favonius is. For all the explanations of how they figured out who other people influenced by Durin are, this sure doesn't seem like it's given the same level of care, especially since this one is the reason for all the deception against the player in regards to the whole thing. And while we're on that, the explanation for just leaving us out of the plan was supposedly because they needed us to be a neutral third party. So let me get this straight. You have no problem arranging for people to fake being against and for Albedo, and you've been planning this for what sounds like close to a year, and it's somehow supposed to make sense that us being left out when we are the linchpin to cornering the bad guy is left completely out of the plan of catching the bad guy in the first place. You don't even have to inform the player that there's a plan in place. The team in Sumeru concocted a plan to save Nahida that the Traveler was in on, but the details of the plan were completely skipped over. I wasn't recording gameplay at the time, but the point is that this is a storytelling device that you can totally use, even in a video game, and it would have worked perfectly here. Anyway, whatever. After the invasion, the job's still not done. Albedo gets an agreement to meet with the Hexen Circle, which is probably our next... The Hexen Circle, by the way, are a bunch of witches and includes Alice. But first, and Albedo's mom. But first, Albedo has someone for us to meet in his office. That someone that Albedo wants us to meet is Mini Durin, the dragon from the storybook world from last year's summer event. The basic idea behind what Albedo wants to do is to, like, resurrect Durin, fused with Mini Durin, so that when Durin fully dies, it can't resurrect as a bad guy, has to resurrect as a good guy. Which honestly may or may not be a spoiler for Ravnica Trail of Dragons over on Spiffy Needle Geeks. We are fighting Nicole Bolas, after all. You kind of expect weirdly convoluted nonsense with these games, honestly, but in this case it does a good job of maintaining an internal logic. In order to get the last ingredients we need to make a future playable character, obviously, we have a trial, which is an actually pretty neat chess-themed boss fight that feels like it's never going to be replayable, which, you know, kind of sucks. This part is pretty short though, since you just go through the boss fight, which has some of the problem of being incredibly difficult if you have the wrong team setup, but this is a complaint about Genshin's current enemy design that's better saved for another video. And then you have some cutscenes of getting Dragon Blood while Albedos has Full Metal Alchemist shit, followed by Venti performing while the alchemy happens, basically to cover up the fact that there's glowing shit everywhere. Most of what could be talked about with this story quest here, I think is actually best served when talking about the quest as a whole. That's one reason that this section is short. The other reason is, like I said, the section is actually way shorter than all the others. So this story quest does a thing that Genshin does, with a slow start followed by an escalation and active pacing. It's pretty normal, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. The payoff for it was pretty neat gameplay-wise, but to me didn't feel like it had a ton of stakes. Now, don't get me wrong, they definitely tried to portray the stakes of what was going on, but there were a lot of paces where I was left expecting, you know, a little bit more. The beginning had basically zero combat, for example, although there was a good reason for that. Maybe we could have brought back some of the courtroom minigames from Fontaine for this, expanded on what we were doing with the fake trial. It was kind of just walking around going from one cutscene to another. The middle portion was pretty neat from a gameplay perspective, and I think the attempt was there, but, well, I don't know. Something about everything just straight up going according to the plan, and there being no real tension about the traveler not being informed by the end of it just made the stakes feel shallow. And then you've got the third part, and I liked the test, but, we could have used with some kind of conflict in getting Durin's blood or something. Each part has its own kind of that was it moment for me. I also think that the quests rely a lot on knowledge of event content. I don't know if any of the dialogue changes if you hadn't played these events, as I know for a fact that when we first meet Scaramouche and Inazuma, it's different if you didn't do the event where he originally showed up back in the day, but it doesn't seem like a lot of this works without knowing the previous events, unless the cutscenes are majorly reworked if you didn't, unless the recollections feature is supposed to replace that. But if that's the case, you know, that's a fairly weak way to find out about some of this stuff for the first time. What I hope is that less story content is locked behind a limited time event in the future, even if certain gameplay elements still are. The hype of going back to Mondstadt for story content is very real, and while I'm not sure this lives up to that hype, I think it's a step in the right direction overall. It gets to the point in ways that Natlan struggled to do. It uses ideas and optimizations for story content from Natlan to refine the way it can tell a story in Mondstadt, and seems to be an effort to keep the good and toss out the bad. If, you know, a little bit of a stumbling block on the way back towards the right path. But, what do you think? Did you enjoy this return to Mondstadt? Did you feel like it underdelivered? Feel free to fuel my own imposter syndrome in the comments, and be sure to leave a like on your way out. Until next time, this is the effin' Boonslayer, signing out.